Welcome to the CANary Cast, the official podcast of the Mr. Canary Company. Before we get started today, please do me a favor. Comment, like, and subscribe to receive notifications when we drop new episodes. This helps new people find the podcast and grows our reach. Here we go, episode number 5, From Sheltered Workshop to Competitive Employer. It is my privilege to introduce Pam Verbark, the Executive Director of the ARC of Greater Boone County, to the podcast. Pam is our brave leader who's not afraid to roll up her sleeves and get stuff done. Listeners, if you don't know already, the ARC of Greater Boone County has its own podcast called Empowered Voices, Stories from the ARC of Greater Boone County. Head over there and listen to episode 2 to hear Pam's backstory as to how she got into human services. I think it's always helpful to understand what motivates people who join this line of work. Welcome, Pam. Since the beginning of this podcast, I've been teasing the listeners with promises of a behind-the-scenes look of how we transformed Main Street marketing from a classic sheltered workshop into an innovative direct employer of workers with disabilities, making competitive wages. Well, today's the day, and we start making good on that promise, and there is no one better suited to explain the saga than you, so thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Nathaniel.
So, Pam, for our listeners who might not know, let's just start right at the top. Can you explain what a sheltered workshop is, and specifically what the 14C program is, which enables these workshops?
Absolutely. So a sheltered workshop is a program that works under a special certificate from the Department of Labor called the 14C certificate. And what that certificate allows employers in sheltered work programs to do is pay people what's called a subminimum wage. Now, that doesn't mean we randomly assign somebody a wage, but we have to go through a series of steps to set a prevailing wage for a job. So say someone is doing a piece of assembly work. So they're putting together a screw and a nut, and we test that process to make sure the amount of time is appropriate. So we'll look at how many screws and nuts that a person can put together in a specific amount of time. And we have to do a test of a non-disabled worker, or actually a set of non-disabled workers. So we have a range and can come down to an average of how much a person without a disability should be able to do in a period of time. Then we take that, sets that into what we call a piece rate. And then a person under that certificate is paid based on what they're able to do in an hour. So if the expectation is a person does 100 in an hour and they hit that wage, and that prevailing wage is done with a study of other assembly type jobs. So we don't just say it's $7.25 an hour. If the prevailing wage in the area for that type of job is $15 an hour, that's the base wage. So if 100 pieces get you $15 an hour, that's what you get paid. But as an example, a worker with a disability might only be able to do 80% of that. So then their wage would be adjusted to that 80% range. Or if a person has a severe disability and only is able to do 10 in an hour, when the expectation is 100, they might be making $1.50. So it's really based on how much the person is able to produce. And each person under that certificate makes a different wage based on what each person individually is able to do. A lot of providers who provide sheltered work programs do keep track of the piece rate production every day, which is what we did when we did that. So people were paid by the number of units that they were able to make in those jobs. Others test people periodically and do an hourly wage based on that. So that person at that 10% of the $15 an hour, I should have done $10 an hour to make my math easier, is making $1.50 an hour, as an example. And that special certificate, it was going to be in process of phasing out altogether across the nation over the next couple of years. My understanding is the Department of Labor has slowed that down, but Indiana has decided that they will no longer be supporting sheltered work services for people, because there were also pieces under the Medicaid waiver program that we're able to pay for our staff in that program. So that will be phasing out by 2027 in India.
Excellent. And thank you for that. I think that was a great overview specifically of how we arrived at the piece rate to be able to compensate our workshop participants under that sheltered workshop model. Can you maybe say a little more about, you mentioned that this is being phased out. Can you talk a little bit about what both camps for and against that program, what they would say were the best parts of sheltered work, and then what the fiercest criticisms
Oh,
were?
absolutely. And I started in the field in 1989. So I will tell you, I've heard criticisms of the sheltered work programs and rumors about sheltered work programs ending in all the years I've worked in this field. So it has been out there for many, many years. And unfortunately, and what often happens is one or two bad players tarnish a program for many people. And apparently, there were some not so savory agencies back in the day that were paying people sub minimum wages when they should have been earning much more. So there were abuses, and of course, there continue to be fears that people will abuse this program and only pay people 50 cents an hour or things like that. So, and of course, I would say some of that also goes back to concerns about overseas labor in many cases where people are not making a living wage and making sure that individuals are protected. So there's that criticism. There's also the criticism that sheltered work was set up to be a training program. And unfortunately, in many cases, what happened is as more people with disabilities started participating in sheltered work, many workers with disabilities found that sheltered work environment very safe and comfortable. So instead of being a training program, that ended up being the person's employer for their entire careers. And we had that even as we made our transition here. We've had people who have been participating in our sheltered work program for 40 years. So that is very much some of the criticisms of that program. In terms of those people who are supporting continuing that program, sheltered work's a choice. And what sheltered work has done and what sheltered work has offered for many individuals is an opportunity to work in a safe and healthy environment with expectations of learning, but those expectations of learning within what that person was able to do. So if I'm one of those individuals with a severe disability, going back to my example of the person who can only produce at 10%, I can continue to have a job, and I can continue to do something that's of meaning to me by doing that work.
Yep.
And the biggest fear of ending those programs came from when programs started to close their doors, is we saw many individuals go from sheltered work programs to home and not having replacement opportunities and to continue to have work opportunities at competitive rates or to have other opportunities to learn other skills.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that paints the picture perfectly. And just, I guess, to bring it down to even a smaller level of what we were doing here at the workshop at the Arc of Greater Boone County, I just want to kind of explain what a typical day would look like for most workshop participants. So the workshop would always open up at 8 a.m. Individuals could be dropped off, whether through their own family caregivers or maybe provider agencies such as group homes would be able to drop workshop participants off at 8 a.m. Individuals would come in, start up at their work assignment for the day. You kind of explained we tracked every piece that individual did. So for each particular, I'll call them shifts just for simplicity for the listeners, but we would basically have shifts that were broken up by different breaks throughout the day. So we'll say that 8 a.m. till 10 a.m. shift, you would have a count sheet. As you'd complete a particular piece of work, you would mark that unit off on the count sheet and you'd move on to the next one. Then at the end of the shift, you would turn in your count sheet for that segment of time, enjoy your break, come back, work the next segment. And so we would have basically 4 shifts throughout the day that were never really more than 2 hours at a time, give people some, time to pause in between and reset. But as you described, Pam, it was self-paced because compensation was tied to individuals, per piece, completion. Individuals could work as quickly or slowly as they wanted. So you ended up with a big range of what individuals were able to produce. On top of that, it was an incredibly flexible program in the fact that as individuals wanted to kind of spin off and go into other programs throughout the day, they had that freedom. But also, if you had appointments that came up throughout the day, there was no real expectation to sit and work through a particular shift. Individuals could come and go as they needed for other demands on their time, we'll say, throughout the day. So that, was a very different model in a lot of ways from community integrated employment, which, is the overall goal for all workers with disabilities. So using that to set the stage now, Pam, you shared, you know, efforts to end 14C have ebbed and flowed over the decades. So can you you touched on it, but can you go a little further into what specifically was behind the timing of your decision to end the use of 14C sheltered work here at the Arc of Greater Boone County?
So the decision here was really based on an opportunity that was offered to us through the state. So it's one that our board of directors considered very heavily because, you know, sheltered work has been the core of our model from our origins when we first incorporated. So we've been doing sheltered work for many, many years. But the state had announced their intention to defund sheltered work programs, but along with that, they also offered the opportunity for organizations to participate in a program grant that allowed us to plan, receive some training, and also set ourselves up to be successful in that transformation. So they actually call them transformation grants. The initial participation in those was attending some workshops that they put on with some consultants and attending some trainings. And then eventually that went into organizations could develop a proposal and funding that would allow us to put the staffing in place for our infrastructure moving forward, um, so that we could make those changes with the goal of organizations being done by the end of their funding period. But that grant ran for until March of last year. Our goal and intent was to make that happen while we had the funding in place, so that we had a little bit of a guardrail in case we needed to make some changes as we did that. So really, that transformation process and project that the state presented was the impetus for our board to make that decision to move forward with the change.
And that makes perfect sense. And, that gave, the outline of why the timing made sense. Can you share a little more? How'd you go about, obviously, this decision affects so many different kinds of stakeholders here at the Arc of Greater Boone County. How did you go about messaging that in a way that spoke to the concerns, the priorities of the different groups of stakeholders here at the Arc?
So I will come back and say there's probably some things I'd do differently if we had to do it again, because I think one of the things that we learned in the process as we did communications and announced our intent to do that was, while we intended that to get to everyone, the message didn't always get to everyone that we wanted it to get to. But we started out, as we started developing that process, we met with our key staff, started developing our plans. We met with our self advocates group and offered that. We provided communications out to families and other stakeholders, and had a lot of conversation with the board of directors as we went through that process. So, again, I'll say the communications weren't perfect, and we would certainly offer more opportunities for people to give feedback for future major changes because we did miss some opportunities in having some of those conversations with folks. We also did utilize some of the state support in bringing in a national expert to talk with families about changing expectations and making that transition so that we could help talk about the mindset. And it was really interesting when we did that particular session because several of the families who came in with one set of thoughts about the changes that we were putting in place and came out saying, "Wow, we could have set higher expectations all along," and it really helped for those who did participate in thinking a little bit differently. And the big piece of what we made sure was part of our plan is we did not want to make that mistake of individuals who wanted to work couldn't have any opportunity to work. So we wanted to commit that anyone who wanted to work would have a role. And as it played out, that ended up being a big part of the plan. And we've been able to, even since we've made the change, and we'll probably come to that later, is we've been able to expand some of the individuals who are working since we've made the changes too.
Yes. And before I, you know, steer this in the direction of Mr. Canary's, piece in this overall puzzle, I just want to applaud you for your humility. I think it's such an important trait in leadership that too many people shy away from. So I think it's refreshing that you're able to admit that there are pieces you would do differently. So I just wanted to applaud you for that real quick. But in parallel, you've got this whole discussion about this really organizational change that's going to affect virtually every department here at the Arc of Greater Boone County. Can you explain, like, what role did the opportunity to acquire the Mr. Canary business play in this overall process?
Um, well, it created an opportunity to build some security about contract work that we do today. As we know, and everybody knows, in industry, so many things are becoming automated today. And over the last number of years, we have seen some of the contracts that we've worked with over the years decline. And part of that is because things have become more automated and they've added use of technology, which I can't fault in organizations. But as we were thinking about our transformation, that became a concern is that Jan, who owned Mr. Canary, had made us aware that she was looking towards retiring and was very thankful that we had first rights on the company. But as that announcement came out that she was ready to make that move, part of what played into our decision was what if Jan hires or sells to someone who wants to completely revamp the production partnership? Because Mr. Canary is the bulk of the work that we have today. And if we don't have control over um, that part of the organization, there's nothing holding that contract in place in the long term. So there was a risk that as we made our transformation, we could lose our work opportunities for the people that we support. And we also recognize within Mr. Canary, there is opportunity to grow that business as well. So growing that business could not just ensure those opportunities for the people we support today, but could expand those opportunities beyond even what we are doing now, and potentially even beyond what we can support with a workforce of individuals with disabilities that we have today. So we tried to look at that opportunity as a way to really think about the future of the organization and utilizing that as another way in uncertain funding times, that Mr. Canary could um, assist in providing additional supports for what we do beyond what our funding pays for.
Can you talk to us about how you structured and organized the planning process for the transformation, since it impacted so many different parts of the organization? Because it's one thing to say, okay, here's the goal of where we want to be on the far end of this, but there's so many moving pieces, so many departments, different leaders, different employee roles that are involved. Like, it was such a big animal to tackle. How did you go about planning how to do that successfully?
Um, so thankfully, again, it's not all me. We have a great team, and the funding did allow us to utilize some consultation in there. It also allowed us to bring on some roles that specifically were focused on the transformation. So we were able to bring on a project manager who helped us through that transformation process. And we were able to bring on a couple of other roles. Some of those were ones that we did as tests. We tried a job developer position as an example, and with other funding changes in vocational rehabilitation, once the grant was out, we didn't continue it, but that funding allowed us to put some of those positions in place that we could test. There are other positions such as our community navigator position, which is one that we've continued to do because we see the value and the additional support that that position is able to do in helping people access community resources on a regular basis. So in terms of the structure, we did a lot of regular meetings. So we did planning meetings with our key leadership team that we'd identified through the process. We brought in the different departments as we needed to. And we did a lot of cross-departmental meetings because, as you mentioned, it's like this not only impacted the um, workshop and the folks there, but it also impacted day services because we went from serving a core group of people in day services who a few of them worked part time in Mr. Canary, but we were going to have that influx of people who, as we changed the format of what things looked like, we would have those changes, and we also included our employment team as well in that team, so that we had all of those different perspectives in there. We also utilized the consultants to do a process called value stream mapping. And it was fabulous having the consultant base help with that process because they walked us through where we are today, where we see ourselves in the future, and then what we need to do to get there. So they did a lot of the groundwork to support us in developing that plan that we carried out as we set up the plan.
I'll jump in a minute to explain how, you know, this set of changes affected Mr. Canary and what we had to do to prepare. But can you speak to what kind of changes we had to roll out for the other departments here at the Arc of Greater Boone County to be able to absorb just this huge structural shift in what a typical day looks like here at the Arc of Greater Boone County?
Oh boy, there's quite a few things in there. We had a department that we had Mr. Canary and your role, Nathaniel, that was managing the logistical pieces of the Mr. Canary part. Then we had our sheltered work program, where we had a manager over that program who supervised the staff who were at the time direct support professionals. And we had 3 direct support professionals in that role. Um, we were not, as we've done the structure, all those positions are not funded positions today. So we were having to think about, okay, where are these staff going to land and what roles do we need in order to shift? Because the individuals that we support, we're going to be splitting their time between their work at Mr. Canary and day services. So, unlike the structure that was in there, it and as Nathaniel mentioned, we were very self-paced in what we did. We did most of our work based on what our orders were. So it was more of a just-in-time model at that point in time. So we had periods of time, frankly, in the sheltered work program where we weren't pushing people to produce at certain rates. And we also had periods of time where we may not have work. So we had things that were called downtime. So we had to fill activities during those periods of time. So we went from a very loose structure there to a very structured structure in terms of what the staff expectations were there. And we've changed the role significantly. But then on the day services end of things, we added supports to help people focus more on work if that's what they're wanting to do. So there was also that fundamental shift in mindset that we are continuing to work through in that program, where day services aren't just the social activities and the different things that they do throughout the day to learn, but they've added a lot more structured activities based on specific learning towards job skills. So we have job skills trainings. We have the community navigator, which works with individuals on accessing places of interest in the community and building relationships in the community and getting out and about. Our person who was the manager of the sheltered work program is now in a role where she's doing case coordination with individuals in our day services program, where she's meeting with each person on a periodic basis, each person initially, and then they also meet periodically to talk about what their specific goals are and to build very specific profiles in what that person is wanting out of their life and what entails a good life, so that we've padded out that person-centered planning process so that individuals have that clearer path of, I want to work, I don't want to work, I'm retired, wherever that person is in their place, helping them define what their good life is. And then the things that we can be doing around our programming to help those individuals achieve those things. So we've very much focused in on a very different focus as we have been doing that. We've also made a lot of changes in our day services program where there are a lot more very specific goal-oriented activities going on in there. And Doug and the team are working a lot with them on um, setting client-directed goals too. So great example is, I think it's this week, they're starting some technology use trainings. So and they've added cooking classes, and they've continued to expand those cooking classes based on demand, so that individuals are able to do those things that they're wanting to do. And they're doing a huge focus on getting people out and in the community more and more as well. So those are many of the different types of things we've been doing. Um, the employment services team hasn't been, I would say with that team, our focus and change has been with them is thinking more in terms of customized employment. So not just thinking about that person who's a good, easy fit into a job that's already presented by an employer, but we've done some training with that team on narrowing down to talk with employers about John and his special skills that could fit a niche job that may not be an 8-hour a day work week, but is there something that John could do that could benefit that business and help them with their pain points? So we've done some training with that group to think a little bit differently in supporting people with more significant disabilities. And obviously opening up more discussions between the groups so that as someone is wanting to move into employment, there's that regular communication happening across the departments.
That's excellent. I think that does such a good job of laying out just how complex this is, but also how worthy it was, because I think the listeners can hear that every step along this transformation, every single department that's impacted, the focus is centered on the individuals we support being supported in choosing and then reaching their ideal life. And so that to me is one of the, I've shared with listeners, I'm also a family member of a person with intellectual disabilities. So, my heart immediately connects with hearing just how much of this was centered on revamping all of our services here at the Arc of Greater Boone County to be able to serve people at the individual level. So thank you for that. And Pam, you actually did a great job kind of laying out, what some of the core changes we had to make at Main Street Marketing Enterprises were as well. But just to kind of put that, wrap that up for the listener, you talked about just in time, going from that just in time production model, that feast or famine, having too much work and then not enough, to, we saw very early on in the planning for this transformation that we were going to need to implement, a balanced production calendar so that we could look at, okay, what's our annual estimated demand by item? How do we split that out over a balanced time frame so that we can have regular schedules that wouldn't just give people work stability, but would also give folks on the other end of the organization the predictability to help individuals plan where those non-work goals come in, right? Because it's hard to schedule a cooking class that is going to take 3 months to complete. It's hard to schedule that if you have these wildly varying work schedules. So that was one part. Pam, you talked about, how we had direct support professionals who managed the workshop, who I would say they had two primary goals. It was make sure we hit the just-in-time production demands, but then more importantly, create that safe and accommodating environment for the workshop participants. That's very different from what we were going to need going forward, in those unfunded roles, as you called them. So the role we developed is a manufacturing coach, and using that language of coach, I thought was important to kind of redirect that the top priority for that role is no longer getting, the production quotas completed by a certain time. The measure of success for that role is helping each individual employee with disabilities unlock their maximum potential and reach their work goals. So it's not getting the work done, it's the way in which the work is done. And so, that was a big mindset shift that, I know we had to lean into and work through just kind of regular touch-based meetings. And frankly, I think some of the most fruitful advances I had with my team of coaches were the impromptu off the cuff meetings of, they'd bring me a concern or bring me some confusion they had about where the planning process was. We'd talk it out, talk through, what made sense, and then really just kind of, and I know this expanded beyond just Main Street, but the idea that it was okay to iterate, that we were going to come up with a plan A that we hoped would turn out, but we were going to have a plan B in case it didn't. And we were open to the reality that it might end up being a plan C or D that we landed on after successful iterations, or should I say unsuccessful iterations. So another big piece of what we had to do at Main Street to get ready for this change was embrace this idea of regular productivity reviews to help determine people's pay raises, because you can't be a direct competitive employer of workers with disabilities without having clear advancement opportunities for them. So for us, it was really important that we had an objective, measurable way to help people chart out their own success. So as they're having these meetings about what their ideal life looks like, we give them a roadmap of how they can go about achieving those goals while they're working with us at Main Street Marketing. So what we landed on was the idea of a 60-day productivity review, where every 60 days we would measure each employee's productivity at their various assigned workstations. And that productivity average would be what determined their pay rate for the next period going forward. That way individuals could have a way to really plan for those work goals. With that, we also realized we needed to realign the workshop. We had, and a lot of that was just tied to the just-in-time nature of it, right? So sometimes we would have more need for one product over another, or we'd have a deadline moved up unexpectedly on one product line versus another. But that created a system where our physical space wasn't really flowing based on efficiency. It was flowing based on where we needed to surge workers for any particular moment in time. So we knew going into this, we needed to realign the workshop so we weren't moving things around when there was no value being added. So it sounds so simple to say, but I think a lot of sheltered workshops would admit that that's kind of the default structure you run into when you have this sheltered workshop model where you're running just in time for contract customers. So the fact that the ARC acquired Mr. CANary really gave us a lot of flexibility to be able to, make those realignments work based on the balanced production schedule we knew we needed going forward. I'll also say one of the things I think really helped our Main Street team with this planning process was a deep clean of the workshop that was needed both just physically and needing to clean the space after, more than a decade of Mr. CANary partnership on a contract level. But beyond that, it was also very symbolic for our team, right? Because we talk about how it was this big paradigm shift, because with that balanced production schedule, we also introduced, a more typical work schedule. If you were scheduled to work Mondays from 9 o'clock to noon, you were expected to show up for that shift, right? And there could be negative results of not keeping that work schedule. And so, things were changing in so many different directions. I thought it was important the physical space had this change, not just the realigning the workflow, but then also having that deep clean to kind of have that mentality. And we shut down for a week. We had support from the rest of our departments here at the ARC to be able to do that shutdown so that our manufacturing coaches and myself could have that kind of mindset shift opportunity. So the last piece of this that we needed to do to be able to prepare to pull the trigger on transforming the workshop from sheltered work to direct employment at competitive wages was we needed to figure out who was going to be working where. And true to the spirit of what we were doing elsewhere in the organization, that needed to be first and foremost the choice of our employees with disabilities. So rather than having coaches assume based on a person's past performance where they would excel most, I came up with the idea that we needed to do workstation interviews. And, most people who were applying, to go from workshop participant to employee, they had a good sense of all the different workstations that were available. But one, they may not have wouldn't have worked every single workstation. So they may not have that direct experience, but they also might not have really had a reason to pay close attention to each particular workstation and what it entailed. So we created some easy DIY videos on our cell phones of what each workstation entailed. We assigned a workstation number to that. We showed one of the manufacturing coaches working the pace that we identified we needed, because that's another big piece of this, right? We quickly realized that we had a certain number of a certain range of productivity we needed to hit to just be financially successful, right? Because we're funding this workshop through the proceeds of Mr. CANary product line. So when we either sell directly to our customers or sell wholesale to our retail partners, those are the margins that are funding this program to support the individuals with disabilities who are our employees now under this revamped model. We quickly identified this idea of 50% productivity, which, we were happy with that because a lot of peer institutions, for what they do, they require a number closer to 80% productivity. And we knew as a team that, if 80% was the threshold, that would be, incredibly difficult for the majority of our participants to hit. So 50% was our number. And we had this idea that, okay, we're going to do these workstation interviews. If you demonstrate that you're on a path to 50% productivity at that workstation, you get to choose. We created little bingo cards. People chose 3 places to interview. They got 15 minutes of hands-on one-on-one training on that workstation. And then there was a timed 30-minute interview that we used to kind of fill out rankings of where people seem to initially excel. That helped us come up with job offers for individuals to work particular shifts, maybe 1 hour, no shift is longer than 3 hours, but some individuals were offered roles at 1 hour a week. Others were offered something closer to 15 hours a week. But we used those demonstrated, self-selected workstation interviews to fill out that first month's roster based on that balanced production quota we knew we needed to hit. And we use kind of reverse engineer those numbers to come up with a total number of shifts and hours worked. And that was just our jumping off point, right? It wasn't perfect, but it was a starting point. I mentioned that 50% number. I got very locked in with that 50% number, but there is a problem with that, right? Because I had my concept of, okay, we've got our manufacturing associates. They're going to be on this path to 50% productivity or better. And that's my go forward strategy because that's what the numbers required. But Pam, will you share with the audience, that led to a very big oops that we almost made right on the cusp of flipping the switch. So can you talk about what that mistake was and how we ended up calling an audible to fix it?
The exact number of people, but the mistake was we started rolling out internally across our staff who was going to be hired as associates. And we realized, I think it was between 18 and 20 people who were not going to get job offers. And remember, I said earlier in the episode that we wanted everybody who wanted to work to be able to work. There were a couple of people in that group of 18 to 20 who had decided they were going to retire, but the rest had continued to express desire to work. And one of our leadership team members came to me very upset, said, "Pam, we said we would hire everybody." And I had to do oh, you're right, we did. So we kind of took a deep breath. Nathaniel and I sat down, put our heads together, and did a quick, okay, we've already got the folks who've been identified as associates. What can we do with these 18 to 20 individuals who would not be offered positions? And we landed on the idea of internships. So we established the intern program very quickly, like within 2 hours?
Yeah, about that.
And came back to those individuals and offered them the opportunities to join as interns. And that, while everybody's not working the number of hours they totally wanted to, it provided that opportunity for everyone, even those who aren't hitting the productivity goals. And going back to my intro, even that person who's at 10% productivity, who has big growth to do to hit 50%, is going to get that. But we looked at what the cost would be to hire those individuals at minimum wage to get them started. And it was well worth the investment to do that. And had that, again, that humbling reminder of we've got to stand behind doing the right thing for the people that we support. So it just helped us do that reality check of making sure the mission stayed at the forefront.
Yeah. And I think that was such a crucial inflection point, right? It's the difference between being a social enterprise and a standard for-profit business, right? I almost lost sight of how important it was to keep that mission first. So I am still incredibly grateful for that member of the leadership team who, came forward, saw something that went against what our mission was and had the courage to remind us of that and challenge us to make that pivot. So I need to pause the discussion here. I'm sorry. I hate cliffhangers and podcasts personally, but there's so much to digest here in this conversation already, which I shouldn't be too surprised, I guess, considering that we're talking about how we went about upending a 50-year-old model of doing things. I think the audience would benefit from a breather. So we're going to turn this into a two-parter. Pam, thank you for being here on the podcast today. and sharing so openly with our listeners. We'll have you back the next episode to wrap up this awesome conversation. To the listeners, please share your thoughts on what we discussed today in the comment section. There is plenty to be added to this conversation, but it hinges on your participation. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast so that you can receive notifications every time we share a new episode. Be sure to check out the links in the show notes for more information. And thank you for joining us for this episode of the CANary Cast. Remember, buy a feeder, create a job. See you next time.